Nice to sort of get a little embodied. So I invite you to just settle into your space and take a moment to recognize that you are entering into satsang with hundreds of people from around the world, this web of hearts and souls connected. I invite you to take a nice big deep breath and feel this loving presence, this presence brighter than all the stars combined that always resides in your heart. And from that space together, we'll welcome Thanissara. She's a Buddhist practitioner for over 40 years, spending 12 years as a nun in the Thai forest school of Ajahn Chah. She's a co-founder with her husband, Kitty Saro, of the Dhammagiri Sacred Mountain Retreat in South Africa, and also the Sacred Mountain Sangha in California. Thanissara is a teacher, author, and poet, and her most recent book is Time to Stand Up. And Ramdas and the grace of Neem Karoli Baba continue to be a guide influencing her dharmic journey. So with that, let us give a big welcome as we look to showing up with love. Thanissara, are you there?
I am here, yes.
All right, it's to you.
Oh, great. Okay, well, thank you so much, Jackie. Thank you, Mangala. Thank you, JR. And big welcome to everyone, wherever you are in the world, whatever time of day. And just picking up on Jackie's welcome and introduction, acknowledging here in the US anyway, it's been a really roller coaster week, to say the least. So let's just continue with those deepening, slowing breaths and arriving. So let's take a few moments just to feel where we're sitting, our connection with earth in our seats, whether in a chair or sitting on the ground, on a cushion, or just wherever our body contacts the earth, soles of the feet on the ground. And just taking a slower, deeper breath through the body into that sensation, grounding us and connecting us deeply into Mother Earth, who is the provider of all nourishment for us, our very lives, every day, every breath. So feeling that breath with your awareness, this fundamental nature of mind and heart, the citta, its fundamental nature of knowing, conscious awareness with breath. Taking that breath through the body with your awareness, soothing, calming, steadying with the inhalation, grounding. And then on the exhalation, just releasing tightness, holding in the body, softening the jaw, dropping the shoulders, softening the belly, palms of the hands, soles of the feet. And a few more slower, deepening breaths, feeling the nourishment of each inhalation. Just arriving into presence, slowing down, arriving into satsang, to community, into the beloved holding that we generate together in this space, and feeling that connection. Connecting with the truth that everything is resident in this one awareness. This awareness transcends time and space and yet is rooted within your heart, in your being here now. Allowing that awareness to just receive what you're with right now. There's no right or wrong way to be. No perfect way. We're not about having to be perfect here. We're about being with how it is and meeting that moment just how it is, starting here with your being, your body, your felt sense, your experience. And as we do that, grounding, slowing down, calming, we're suffusing that awareness with this kindly, loving, open receptivity, receiving your being, your body, your felt sense, your life, your everything with this vast, embodied, spacious, loving awareness that Baba Ramdas always talked about, always manifested. In this loving awareness, Ramdas, our great teacher, who opened so many doors fearlessly, feeling him here with us in this loving heart, this loving awareness. His smile, his presence, his laughter. And of course, at the heart of his devotion, invoking Baba Neem Karoli Baba, Santa Maharaj, this great, beyond words being, great grace, timeless, ever present, ever in this heart, inviting always inward into the great mystery of reality, the core of which is this undying love manifested through Maharaj-ji, invoking that to be present with us also at this time, in this space. As we enter satsang, we invoke love and presence and guidance through our devotion, through our gratitude. There's manifestation of Hanuman, of Ram, through the great holy presence, sacred presence, powerful presence, Neem Karoli Baba. Breathing that through the cells, the bones of our body, of our ancestors, freeing on the exhalation all that holds us back, all that hinders, all that obstructs, dissolving those obstructions in this river of conscious being love that is the core of each and every being. Breathing that in through our whole being, breathing out, releasing whatever stress, pain in ourselves, through our lineages, our ancestry, our family, communities, this world. Extending that great love through the whole world, through this planet, in particular this country here that we call the United States, this ancient land, Turtle Island, the ancestors here. We give gratitude for our presence here. We pay respects. taking refuge in this heart, this timeless heart. So welcome again, everyone. I'd like to just reflect a little bit in this Dhamma, these Dharma reflections on the moment that we're in here, and that's particularly as it's catalyzed here in the US, but of course we're in a very global world, so what's happening here is incredibly impactful around the world. In particular, there's a lot of eyes and attention to this moment, and to orientate that within our spiritual and Dharma practice and devotion. This great crisis, this also at the core of which speaks to our planetary emergency that we're in, and speaks to, invites us to really orientate around that in terms of how we understand our practice actually. How that practice can equip us for these times. Our teacher, I say our, doesn't really belong, this great teacher, great master, meditation master, Ajahn Chah, from the deep forests of northeast Thailand. He always talked about a practice as preparation for when powerful, difficult, overwhelming things hit the citta, hit the heart, hit the mind. We prepare that mind, prepare that heart to meet what is without being flooded and overwhelmed and carried away and lost in that overwhelm. And then being caught in a vortex that takes us into feelings of collapse, despair, sort of crashing our whole system. So this practice in that way never stops. It always is something we call on, and this is a refuge, the refuge into that practice. Whatever that practice may be, a practice of mindful attention, a practice of devotion and invoking through our devotion the presence of the awakened heart and consciousness through our great guru, Sri Baba Maharaj, Baba Ramdas, or through Sri Hanuman, or whatever way that we invoke that spiritual stream of conscious awakening, as it's awakening also through us, through all humanity, through all beings at this time. And also to just reflect on how we're using this practice at this time. Is it enabling a bypass of, or an abdication from being able to effectively and appropriately respond and engage the imperative of our times? There is an imperative, there is an urgency, there is a call here now. There's a choice that we're making individually, collectively, globally at this time, a very, very critical choice that we're all part of. And even if we're not consciously engaged in that choice is happening with our consciousness. And what we collude with unconsciously and go along with, or what we make conscious, and then through the power of intention, which, as the Buddha said, intention is the forerunner, mind is the forerunner of all things. So this intentionality is very powerful. This human mind focused in intention, which is something we can consciously do, has a power to it. So, it's not the moment to abdicate from that power, or to not understand how to align in that power and direct it for the great work of overcoming suffering, death, illusion, delusion. So we have the, really as classically said in the spiritual practice, are we, the analogy of it being a snake in the way that the snake symbolizes great power, actually great transformative power. The snake is often been depicted in a very negative way, but it's also alchemically and shamanically represents the power of transformation. The snake, in a way, moving on with its belly across the earth, the holder of earth knowledge, earth secrets, and also has venom that can either be medicine or can poison. And this is the analogy of the power of spiritual practice, how we use this practice and the power that accrues with that practice. Can we pick that up? In the Buddhist metaphor, they have the image, I think it's Buddhist, it all sort of becomes at my time of life a bit conflated. Do we pick that up, correctly to extract that power and turn it into medicine? Or do we pick it up, so that we can enter through the portal that's opening for us at this time on the planet? Or do we pick it up in a way that it whips round and poisons? And so our practice is a distorted manifestation. It's sort of like a poison chalice. I mean, historically, Buddha's great disciple, Devadatta, the Buddha talked about who, as someone not worthy, that he wouldn't, who was trying to take over the Buddha's order. He actually tried to kill the Buddha. He was a very impressive yogi, actually, great powers. He had psychic powers. He was a very ascetic. He split the order. People followed him. That sort of false power that's very seductive. As I meant, Maharaj-ji said, you've got to have a working knowledge of gurus. You've got to really kind of have some discernment. So the Buddha, when Devadatta was trying to take over the order, he said, the Buddha said, I wouldn't even at this point give the order to my main primary disciples, Moggallana and Sariputta, never mind a lump of spittle like you. And the Buddha didn't mince his words. He wasn't. And when we talk about love, showing up with love, sometimes it sounds like we just got to be nice. And that's completely erroneous understanding of the power of what love is. Not that I can actually be an authority on what love is, actually. But we all know that this is a journey into deep love. So how to marshal our energy and our focus for the task ahead. And at the moment, of course, we're in a curriculum. I know Ramdas always talked about doing the curriculum that we're in. And I think we always perhaps looked at that, especially those of us that were on his coattails 40 odd years or whatever it was ago, when Be Here Now came out, which was my first spiritual book. And completely, I was in the wave of trying to doggy paddle behind his great wave that he left. He talked about the curriculum. I always felt it was perhaps something to do with the personal curriculum that we're in. But we're in a sort of global curriculum, systemic curriculum, which is one of the main pieces I really want to bring into our awareness in terms of our practice, to bring the global and the systemic into our awareness as part of our practice, not just our personal journey. Of course, it all interfaces, but to make that very conscious. So this is a curriculum we're in, and it's been a very tough one. 2020 in many ways has been like an initiatory year. to reflect on that in a moment. I think if we thought 2021 was going to be easier sailing, and I know the astrology all lined up to give us that hope, and I think that's energy is definitely there in the cosmos, to sort of bring wind to our sails, positive wind to our sails. But however, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be any less tough in terms of the profound work that transformation that is our curriculum now. And certainly this coup attempt that's been happening in the US has flagged up we haven't even got through the first week of 2021. We just passed that first week. So I don't think that heralds an easier year ahead, but a deepening into the challenge. Where here in the US, it's really made conscious the shadow of the US project, if you like. And it's, the foundational rock, really, that it's been built on, or the unconscious violence that it was founded in. And it's, in many ways, we could look at Trump, the journey of Trump over the last 4 or 5 years, which has been an excruciation, as in part about his role as catalyzing that or exposing that shadow or embodying he's like a mirror, looking into a mirror of what the shadow of American power and our civilizational power, what that's been actually partly built on, founded in. The colonial project of 500 years, the extraction and the plundering from Mother Earth without any regard to Mother Earth being a conscious being, a desecration of the sacred web of life, the split between us, this mind, the abstraction of the human mind from embodied, ensouled, living world that requires and needs respect, every aspect of it. Those understandings aren't built into the power of empire. The narcissism, the extreme focusing of the human psyche, its self-aggrandizement at the expense of everything, the cruelty and the violence, and all of this really hasn't actually been processed consciously. It's just been festering, and there are many, many other causal aspects to what has been exploding this week in the capital, which is so, of course, fundamentally, archetypally, such a metaphor, the core of power, to see the tentacles of that shadow operating at the very core, the capital, into all aspects of American life, right into the disaffection at the heart, the lostness in the psyche of our modern life, a certain lostness that we have. So in a certain way, we definitely have, I think, missed a bullet, which is the bullet being a fascist takedown. But the agenda and the curriculum hasn't stopped. We've just been a little pause to say, okay, how are we going to respond? What is our consciousness here? And this is part, we can, right now we can say, oh, this is just political. But this is a part of our consciousness that we have to attend to, actually, when we start to see things through the prism of the collective. And really at the heart of this moment that we're in, and what, as I see it, and what the heart of the curriculum and agenda that we're in, the heart of that, well, that's really inducting us into, initiating us into, through this very fierce curriculum that we've been through, these very tough few years for us, say in the more privileged world, of course, for those that have been in marginalized communities, BIPOC community, First Nation peoples around the world, colonized peoples, and so on. This has always been the curriculum. But, you know, globally, there's a waking up and a choice that we're in the cusp of, or in the process of. You know, and so that choice is a choice really of an imperative, an invitation of, are we co-participants in an evolutionary moment that has the potential for us to embody this higher dream of humanity, higher dream of nature, higher dream of life itself, that's sort of always moving into this embodied manifestation of the heart's potential, but that being demonstrated, as the Buddha demonstrated, as Maharaj-ji demonstrated, Ramdas, as all these great saints and sages, as the sacred activists have demonstrated. Mr. Mandela, as I worked many, many years with my husband and partner, Thanissara, in South Africa. Great, great presence that brought to the world stage a moment of consciousness that was unique in a way, of love, of unification, through his own deep entering years of a trial, 27 years in prison, and overturning and transforming that poison of apartheid into the spirit of a unified consciousness, a moment of helping a whole country lift up. There's a massive amount of work to do. It's not that solved everything by any means, but it stopped a descent into a bloody war, which is also happening. So this path of these are examples of that evolutionary movement and embodying that and bringing that forth into the world, which we all have that capacity for. We might not believe we can be a Mr. Mandela, but we don't know what we can be. That's the mystery, you know, what we're guided to be, but we can be open to that. Or do we just abdicate and bypass and sit it out and let things sort of devolve and spiral into a path of what we're seeing now: nationalism, fascism, tribalism, chaos, war, conflict, destruction, and actually extinction. It's like it couldn't be clearer. So this is if we've been feeling some pressure, then that would be accurate. This is working. This process we're in is working on all of our psyches at very deep levels, in our being, in our psyches, personally, through our families, through our communities, through our institutions, through our societies. And at the core of this is this, I suppose it's really like, can we grow up to meet this challenge? You know, can humanity really get it together? And we have been given tools. Carl Jung said, and he's talking about what we're experiencing now. It's quite helpful to understand the unconscious. This when the unconscious is unintegrated into the conscious mind, when it's just actually activated and given permission to act out without any navigation through conscious awareness. And it's very destructive. So Carl Jung said, in the unconscious of every individual, there are instinctive propensities charged with considerable tension, really deep places. And I'm just paraphrasing on that. deep places where we hold, instinctual places of fear. It's the separative consciousness, where we feel separate, vulnerable, rage, fear. These are places in each of us, actually. They might not be conscious to us, but they often are held in the psyche and frighten us. And so they're split, and we defend from them. And usually they're moderated through social norms, social morals, religious morals, and so on. And if we understand the inner journey, then we can start to moderate that through mindful, aware, conscious knowing, so that we start to transmute those raw energies, instinctual energies. And so they become, servants, really, to the evolution into light. Light, conscious, loving, empowered, clear response. But when that's not tended to, not mindfully mediated, Carl Jung went on to say, when those energies, just in their pure instinctual form, are helped in one way or another to break through into consciousness, and there's no opportunity to intercept those energies and transmute them into higher forms, they sweep everything before them like a torrent and turn people into creatures for whom the word beast is still too good to name. They could be called devils. To evoke such a phenomena in the masses, all that is needed is for a few possessed persons, or only one. And such a person, if that person taps in to those common instinctual forces, which is common to the majority or to a great percentage of the population of any nation, then one of those single complex ridden individuals, which we've seen who's been a president with enormous power, who at the same time sets themselves up as a megaphone, is enough to precipitate a catastrophe. So this was someone who was mapping out what we've been living through. And Baring, who's a Jungian analyst, a great mapper also of the journey of human consciousness, in her book, core book called The Dream of the Cosmos, which is very worth looking up. It's a bit of a tome. She also talks about how this is really an initiation. This understanding is really helping us understand and see, as she said, the importance through Jung's work, where he analyzed, particularly in terms of what happened in fascism in Europe in the last, in the Great War, the Second World War, which I was born in the shadow of that, the ending of that in London. Where Jung analyzed how these negative projections spread like a virus. I don't know if you've come across the Waitiko idea of this virus that contaminates a whole group or a nation and causes a mass psychosis, meaning a break with reality. So Jung was looking at that and looking at the core causal dynamic around that is the permission to project this unconscious shadow, this untended places of our pain, of our rage, of our upset, to project that onto the other, and to create the evil other. That's what we've seen, that dynamic unfolding through history, through Maoist China, through Nazi Germany, through so many different examples of that, Stalinist Russia, and so on. And we nearly had a version of it here. We're still in the heart of that, really. I'm still fighting that. We're still in a battle. But we have a very, as humans, we don't have to, this is the work of mindfulness, is the more mindfulness there is a choice, we can mindfully apprehend those forces and own them in ourselves and start to work with them. And this is the work of, this is spiritual, this is the sort of the curriculum that Ramdas always talked about of our spiritual work. It's not just trying to vault ourselves into the light and into the divine. It is that in some ways of invoking the divine. It's not, I don't actually really see it about trying to become divine. I think leave the divine to the divine. I think we invoke the divine, we invoke Maharaj-ji, but our work is to become more fully human in the fullness of that. And then there may be the grace to be the conduit for the divine that happens for, that can happen in moments, and for all of us, to some, and for some it's, more deeply embedded. So in that way, in some ways, I guess before this talk, I was thinking like Trump is a bit like Ravana in the Ramayana. I hadn't really thought of that before, but he's sort of it's been horrific, but he has been the one that has catalyzed to some degree and brought the unconscious, the collective unconscious into the conscious. And manipulated that as a weapon, of course. He's a very dangerous man because of that, a very dangerous moment that we're in, and we're not out of that. But what is important for us is to understand what we're in, and to understand that none of this is outside of our practice. That our spiritual practice must include a path of integrating the shadow, to put it in Jungian terms, or in the Buddhist terms, the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha taught at the core of his first and most profound teaching. Actually, there's so many profound teachings in the catalogue of the Buddhist lineage, but there is this experience of dukkha, of suffering, and suffering needs to be turned to be contemplated. Suffering is a portal in that way into the transcendence of suffering, but it's not by bypassing that experience, but by going through that portal, through the portal of death. You don't find the deathless without going through death. You don't find non-suffering without really opening to the journey of suffering. And this is very hard for us, but if we understand it's actually part of our practice, and a necessary part of our evolutionary process, then of course it's an opportunity. This is the journey through the hindrances in that path, in that way of speaking. And so in that way, our teacher Ajahn Chai said, don't be too quick to be a Buddha or an enlightened one or an awakened one. If you're going to be anything, be an earthworm, because at least an earthworm's going through the mud and working with, the content of what is here. And when we come to meeting all of this with love, certainly the bodhicitta, bodhisattva vow or intention, one of these intentions, I talked about intentionality at the beginning of the talk, that we can hone intention. One of the core of the intention of the bodhicitta is to actually to focus within compassion for all, that our practice isn't just for ourselves, although we start with ourselves, but it is an offering and an act of service for the collective. And when that happens, when there's a focusing, when that training in compassion, then there's a lot of energy there to help support us through the valley of shadows that we must pass through on this journey as humans. And for us now, we're really doing that not just for ourselves personally, I hope, anymore, but really understanding we're part of a collective, a really profound collective, both reckoning, a civilizational reckoning, really, globally, on a global level, but at the fulcrum of that, because the empire, recent empire, has been the US power. It's happening here, and so it's impactful. But we're also in this same moment, on the other side of that same coin, a moment of great awakening and opening and possibility. So it's intense, for sure. And so to keep breathing, to keep steadying, to keep being willing to stay with the unknown, actually, to realize that there is the possibility of there is another power. There isn't only worldly power, ego power. I remember that story, I don't know if you remember, when Maharaj-ji was sitting on his tucket in India, and down the road there was Indira Gandhi, and there was a great sort of celebration of her, whatever it was, I guess, becoming a prime minister. Great hurrah, brouhaha thing going on down the road. And Maharaj-ji, in this flick of consciousness, just saying, look at all that. And it's just another worldly king. And then Ramdas having this moment of realization, this just another worldly king. Maharaj-ji's consciousness was in such a different place, such a sort of universal, timeless awareness that had a massive perspective on the arising and passing, perhaps not just of worldly kings, but of eons in this unmoving, conscious, core, brilliant, loving heart. But to journey into that, I think there is this surrender, isn't there? This path, ultimately, however much we can figure out and manifest and navigate the path of practice, there's a moment of surrendering to another power. It isn't a power that we can actually sort of manipulate for our ego concerns. It's a power that demands the stepping down of this brilliant mind of ours into the heart. The journey, I remember Ramdas, when Thanissara and I spent a little time with him, very special sacred time in Maui, in Hawaii. And he talked about the longest journey from the head to the heart. This heart. And I remember I had this moment. I was in Nainital. I was, as a Buddhist nun, I was on pilgrimage, and I also took the opportunity to go to Kanchi with my friend and attendant, and to many of Maharaj-ji's, and there's some really miraculous unfoldings in that journey. And we went to Kanchi, we went to Nainital, and we went to Dadaji's, and it was a wonderful, and it was so nourishing and beautiful, and listening to Dadaji's stories and being fed. But I remember as we were on the bus, we were leaving Nainital, the chaos of the bus station, and as a Buddhist nun at that time, I had a vow, had all these observances that I had to attend to, and one of them was to eat before noon, my one meal a day. So there was, I was like, I'd get very anxious as the clock was ticking down. So I was sitting on this bus, and there was a part of me that was a bit disappointed. I suppose in my mind, I was like really wanting to see Maharaj. Of course, it was ridiculous because he'd already left that form, the form that we all know him in. And I was sitting there, and I was also really anxious because, I was going to miss my meal probably. So, and I looked out the window, and I saw this guy. He had a kurta on, and he was dhoti and is white, and he looked crazy. He had betel nut juice coming out of his mouth, and he was like wheeling around, and he was like this crazy guy. And I looked, and I thought, oh God, I hope that guy doesn't get on this bus. And as he was it was almost like he must have heard the thought form, because suddenly he just made a beeline to the bus. And my memory of it, maybe it wasn't like this exactly, but my memory was that he got on the bus and I was sitting at the back, and he just sort of looked at me, and then he said in this perfect English accent, he said, "Madam, don't worry, bus is not going on time like in England." And I nearly died. My heart just stopped, and he kind of walked up and he came and he just looked, and he kind of looked with this intensity. And suddenly I was like, first of all, I was like, please, if like for an English person to be on a bus and called out, it's like toe curling. It's not like, oh, great, someone sees. It's like, oh God, you just want to kind of like disappear. So I was like, oh my God, and then please don't come up the aisle. And then he did. And then he just looked with this intensity, and I could not meet his gaze. And then he just said, "Where are you going?" And we had this whole plan. We were going to another temple town and this and that. And so I'm like rabbiting away. We're going here, there. And then he said, well, and then he just said, if you think you know where you're going, you don't know anything at all. And then he just walked off the bus, and I was my whole body was completely thunderstruck, actually. And I looked out the window, and he had disappeared completely. And it took me years, for some reason, to realize maybe that was a visitation, grace, a moment of grace. But that lesson, if we think, and for me, that's the portal, the opening. I put in the write-up when Sri Nisagardatta said that the reality comes in the form of the unexpected. This ego power, we think we're in control, of course. We think we're these knees, us humans. We are controlling so much. We're controlling the destiny of the earth, it seems. And it's terrifying what we're doing, because we're completely midgets with this huge powers that we're using, not guided by wisdom, compassion, understanding, and of our part in the web of life. So we have this tremendous ego power. But there is another card player here, the player of reality itself. So I think we can, with the love, or the training of the Bodhisattva heart, this is our human work, the integration and the willingness to work through our curriculum, not just personally, but to bring the systemic, the collective curriculum, the humble task of being here, not only for ourselves, but for each other. The patient work of that, the journey of that through and into love, by seeing all the places where we don't meet with kindness, with love, or we meet with impatience, or we're caught in our agenda, or we're manipulating things. It's quite humbling. But to do that work and to keep purifying the heart, as the Buddha said when asked, what is the Dharma practice? He said, it's lifting up that which is wholesome and good, overcoming the unwholesome, and purifying this heart. This is the teaching of all Buddhas. There's purifying the heart. And that purifying the heart, as Ajahn Chah would say, a purified heart. At a certain point, we practice the Dharma, we study the Dharma, we know the Dharma, we practice the Dharma. At some point, we might be the Dharma. We become conduits for the living Dharma, for that grace, for that unknowing reality that we don't know, but it can manifest. I remember one of the very early on, I share this story with you about a connection with Maharaj-ji, as I know we all love these stories. They're like nourishment, they're like food for our faith. Faith that, in the depth of such grace that we're in, that there is this depth of love and consciousness that's undying. It is our true heart ultimately as well of every being. Very, very early on in my journey, when I was still at that time exploring through altered states, I'd taken a journey with mushrooms, and actually I didn't know what I was doing, and it was too much, too high a dose. And I found my body just completely rigid. I couldn't move, I couldn't, so it's like this moment of great fear. But before I'd entered into that, I was in a place in my life where I was incredibly confused. I didn't know what to do. So I thought, well, I'll do this journey and I'll get some answers. That was my plan. And I wrote all my questions. And in my mind, I thought, I'm going to sort of enter this sort of gate crash, I suppose, this great consciousness, and then, figure it all out and write answers and then have a plan. So what actually happened was not that. What actually happened is that everything dissolved on me, and I found myself suddenly in this, I can't, this space, as this space, but in this consciousness. And Maharaj-ji was there. And I was just aware of the love. I was just, and that word is too cheap a word. It's too twee to try and capture the enormity of this bliss and eternal. And as I was looking, I could see the form and what he was saying, not in words, but what he was saying is, I'm just a shell. This is the Ram, this is reality, this is what you're tasting, I'm just the shell, I'm just the pot, I'm just the container. So it was a darshan, that was grace. And then when I finally did find my body somewhere and came back, this was maybe 40 odd years, a long time ago, I looked at that list of my questions, and I wept. I wept for the lostness of my ego. I just thought, I don't know anything. This ego really doesn't know anything. It thinks it knows so much. It's yeah. And yet this ego is our conduit too. I don't hate the ego. I think that's a mistake. I think we integrate that and help. It helps us, but it certainly can't be in control in the way that it's been used to. And so this is the stepping down, the invitation to step down from the throne that it's been on inwardly and as a humanity. And in that process, as we become more fully human, purifying this heart, may we invoke all the Buddhas, the Bodhisattvas, the stream of pure conscious love awakening that we understood and touched in whatever ways has touched us. Neem Karoli Baba, the great saints, Ombri Baba, this great lineage of saints from that part of India. From this, that they haven't gone, it hasn't gone anywhere. Anandamayama, Ram, Hanuman, the mysterious breath of reality of Ram. May these beings, when we meet this moment, this time, this is a time to call on and bring into our hearts this grace, to support whatever we can do as we pick up the task of our times. We enter the lineage not only of the awakening stream of grace, but the lineage of activists. As Mahatma Gandhi said, if we think, oh no, he was criticized once for doing political work. If you're a Mahatma, He was all about engaging systemic change. He spent 21 years in South Africa. That was his training ground. Very tough. Came back to India, took down the British Empire. I mean, that was not a small feat. When he was criticized, he says, if I seem to take part in politics, it's only because politics encircles us today like the coil of a snake from which one cannot get out, no matter how much one tries. I wish, therefore, to wrestle with the snake. What would have happened if he hadn't picked up that challenge? What would have happened if Mr. Mandela hadn't have picked up that challenge? What would happen if we don't pick up the challenge? What would have happened if Hanuman hadn't picked up the challenge and rescued Sita to bring that lost soul? It represents the lost soul of this, our lostness, our ego lostness, to bring back to Ram in the heart. What if we can't default on that quest? That we have such enormous powers to support us. We have the grace of this blessing, of this satsang. We've been given enormous teachings, a great raft, the Buddha, to make the raft from whatever's around you. Don't make the perfect, cruise liner. Whatever's around you, make your raft to traverse the sea of suffering. Trust this heart, the knowing of the heart, even if it doesn't know, but it knows everything. Align with the discipline of the bodhicitta, the bodhisattva. That's the path of love. That doesn't mean we have to like or prove, but it does mean that we're willing to work with it. Whatever it is, betrayal, that's a hard one. What we experience as criticism, pain, death, grief, overwhelm, our karmic conditioning, our family conditioning. As Maharaj-ji said, don't throw anyone out of our heart. That's a practice. It's a practice. It's not just a wishful thinking. It's a hard one. When you really hate someone, actually. How do we do that with a figure like Trump? What's going down now? How do we hold all of that and meet the challenge? Maybe with fierce challenge back, like the Buddha. I wouldn't give the order to you like a lump of, to Devadatta, a lump of spittle like you. He wasn't being nice. So we have this invitation to enter this leap of awakening, to return to the roots of the sacred, to understand that we're in a birth canal of sorts, that every awakening and opening is preceded by a great trial, like birth itself. So let's take the journey, and whatever it is and whatever it brings us to, the practice remains, the devotion remains. The grace is always here for us to turn to call on. Mindfulness can always be called forth to undertake the journey through the shadows, to transmute them into love, into pure awareness, into conscious, loving presence. So I hope there's a few things there that you can chew on a little bit. I have some time. Do you have any questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Thanissara. So many good things to chew on. So you sort of started the talk talking about how the world feels crazy and we get caught by this contamination. You talked about the this refuge, that practice can bring us to this refuge of mindful devotion. And just you saying that word, like finding a refuge, feels so lovely. And one of the questions that's come up is, how do we sort of get into that refuge? Like, how do we get into the spiritual heart?
Well, of course, we're sort of always in the spiritual heart. We've just, it's a sort of turning. Just a very simple practice we were doing as we entered into this session of what I do, like the deepening, slowing breath, slowing down, feeling the breath, and not splitting the spiritual away from your embodiment or what you're feeling. In the Buddhist frame, the refuge, the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, the three dimensions, if you look at them esoterically and internally, they're quite helpful orientation markers. So the Buddha, of course, it's the historical and the lineage of Buddhas and awakened ones that we align with, but it's this Buddha literally means to know. So it's this internal knowing presence. So the first refuge is aligning with your present awareness. This is an aspect, a dimension of your being that's always here. Everything's happening within this awareness. So when you slow down and take some deeper, slower grounding breaths, you're literally sort of unhooking from the complexity of the cognitive mind frames, and it's simply, you're simplifying. The presence is very simple. It's the most obvious aspect of our being. It's very simple. So you just feel, and that presence, that knowing is knowing what? It's knowing Dharma. Is that the Dharma teachings, but Dharma, as our teacher Ajahn Charles said, everything is within the Dharma. Everything is teaching us. So what's teaching you now? Grief, maybe loss, maybe fear, maybe aspiration. So you contemplate that energy. And then there's the practice, practice. And then what's needed? And that's where you might say, I really recognize I feel really down at this moment. I feel deflated. And so maybe that might be a moment to say, well, your practice of japa, of holding sacred name, of devotion, or of mindful meditation, of loving kindness meditation, then we're applying, this is Sangha. Sangha is practice. Sangha is satsang, community, but the essence of it is we're practicing. So it's the practice. Once we start to bring in the practice, mindful breaths, listening to a talk, reading, something that reminds us, then we're actually in the realm of the refuge. Don't look for a big, like the refuge, a big sparkly experience. It's what it is here now, So then we realize the refuge is very accessible.
Reassuring. You also talked about suffering as a portal, which I love, that visual of it. Like the only way through it is through it. We can't jump around it. And yet the nervous system often seems like it hits pain and tries to jump away, right? And we go to all sorts of different things to sort of get away from it. And so someone asks, like, for advice to help process difficult emotions as they arise, like guilt and fear and trauma, and maybe how to help others do the same.
That's a really good question. And I think it's a really core question for the work I've been talking about, is working at this edge where we feel the experience of whatever form or shape that experience of dukkha, suffering, hits. I think first of all to say that we have a greater capacity to hold and manage and transmute that experience of suffering than we often think we do. So our reactions are often very habitual, just like that moving. But so the training, in a way, and this, for my monastic training, was great at this, because Ajahn Chah was a teacher that pushed you into, if you were trying to bypass something, he would push you to what you didn't want to meet, like working with someone you didn't like, or sitting up all night, which we did once a week, and you go through every feeling and emotion. Or in the training of mindfulness, and the second foundation of mindfulness, I love the simplicity of working with feeling. The feeling is actually complex, of course, and it's profound. But the simplicity of meeting, the Buddha says, is this feeling, is this, if you come out of the cognitive story around what's being felt, like I shouldn't feel this, I should feel great, and I feel like crap, and I feel defeated, and how could they, and if you come out of all of that and say, where is the feeling in your body? So the embodied aspect is really important for transmuting, to come to the somatic. How is this felt? And then the mindful attention with investigations. Mindfulness is always married with contemplation and investigation, just to hold that steadiness. This feels, how is it? And the Buddha says, is the feeling pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral? So sometimes to extract yourself from the big story, which can turn us into a vortex, is just to go, this is a really unpleasant feeling tone. So as you're staying there, we're building that capacity and to stay steady in the face of what is unpleasant. And as you breathe there, actually there's something about when we finally meet dukkha, it's a relief. It's like, okay, it's actually more dukkha to keep avoiding things. So, okay, I'm just going to meet this. As you breathe there, what actually starts to happen is an alchemical energetic shift starts to happen. And that energy that is presenting to you as pain has a chance to transmute and be released. And sometimes that transmutation can change it. It can alchemically change into love, courage, strength, understanding. And our Western teacher, Ajahn Sumedho, Western monastic teacher, he said it's a bit like, when you're meditating, when you're doing this inner work, it's a bit like, the demons come, the suffering come, the places we don't want to be with. And they're like in the dungeon, that's a shadow. They're like in the dungeon, and they sort of come, they're coming out for air. They want you to notice them. And he says, we sort of slam the cell door on them and push them back, as we're frightened, or they don't fit our image of what it is to be spiritual. I can't be angry because that's not spiritual. I can't be enraged, so and then we just repress. And that's the thing that the mindfulness, in a way, you're learning, you can open that door and allow what is to be met. And so you're freeing the prisoners of consciousness. He will call them the orphans of consciousness. As those beings, as though they're like beings or shapes or energetic constrictions, as they, and some of them are epigenetic, meaning they've come from your family lineage, your ancestral lineage, deep traumas that we're releasing now. We need to release these now, rather than repatterning them through our systems. This is a moment, this is the portal of freedom. Let's free our ancestors, let's free ourselves, let's free humanity from these old, oppressive, conditioned voices of fear and unworthiness and collapse and can't, so as those voices, and they're coming with more intensity because it's the moment. If it's too intense, then we can start calling, and this is the puja, the practice of bhakti and puja and prayer, to mix into, the Buddha gave this analogy. So these are like salt crystals. They're very bitter. If you put them in a cup of water and trying to drink them, they're quite poisonous. They're quite bitter. But if you put them in the Ganges, then they dissolve. You don't, so these old karmic things that are coming up for air, you start to do a Hanuman Chalisa, for example. I mean, Kisar and I would sit and do the Hanuman Chalisa when things get heavy, and you feel those salt crystals start dissolving, or the Parita blessing chants from the Buddha, or the Guan Yin's great compassion mantra, or we do these every day. And we don't do them every day, but all of them. But this bhakti, or the prayer, or the holding of the name, a sacred name, these are extra powers that you can bring in to support that process of dissolving those salt crystals.
Oh, it's such a beautiful image, just to feel them be held by something bigger. One of my mantras is often like, well, I can't do this, but the great beings can, so I'm gonna let
Yeah,
them.
sometimes we, like the other day, we made a meal offer to Maharaj-ji, some other meal. You can do something extra if it's really like, oh my God, and you can do it on behalf of the country, do it
Yeah.
on behalf of of the whole
That's,
thing
I love
as
that.
well.
Brilliant. Brilliant. So you may have sort of answered this already, but just a little more pointedly, you talk about opening that door and the demons coming out and meeting it with love, and that like this idea that love can kind of keep us steady. And at the same time, it's just such a hard thing to describe. Like you said earlier, like it's sort of a cheap word, and we're not like experts in it. Um, but I'm curious if you could sort of speak of the qualities, um, almost like translate it a little bit of this. I had like when we're speaking of opening the door and meeting it with love, that might be able to transmute. What does that mean?
It's a very good question. I've been actually really pondering that for this talk, because I know that there's Greek words to describe the different qualities of love, which I haven't got at my fingertips. It's not a tradition I've trained in, but to me, maybe perhaps patience might be a better expression. Non-reactive patience, even to the reactivity. I mean, that is actually sometimes underestimated in this path of purification. Ajahn Chah would sometimes talk about patient endurance. That there's some things that you can't just magic away with a wand of like, I just love this, do a few chants and it will go. There are some deep karmas, whether they're personal or collective or wherever the hell they come from, when they appear, and that's the edge of our work, and they've been with us, sometimes things take time. They take the time they take. But the difference is one isn't feeding that sankhara, that kilesa, that kind of shape, that patterning, samskara. One isn't feeding it. One isn't putting more energy in it. So you're holding a different relationship to that experience at that moment. So what I've noticed over time, maybe sometimes years, that same pattern will be activated. I'll go into my weird, crazy, upset Thanissara mode and kind of completely lose it. But what I notice is not necessarily all the time, but I notice that often the power of it to crash my whole system, or the length of it in terms of how long that state stays, is much shorter, much quicker, and it moves through more quickly. So it becomes sometimes these deeper sankharas neatly consuming and shaping us. And so you could call love patience, kind patience, non-reactivity. You could, and that's a kind of a strength. That's a kind of a building block of our capacity to hold steady in the face of what is unbearable. Sometimes called the unbearable wounds to being. And that maybe that's an act of faith as well, faith to the practice. That you can't sort this out. Actually, you aren't really doing the practice. The practice is doing us. And there's this lovely phrase in the Dharma, which is that the practice in and of itself overcomes obstructions. So the idea I'm doing this is actually coming from a false premise and sets us up for all sorts of problems, because then we have success and failure, and I'm a bad yogi, and I'm hopeless and I can't. But once we can, and the practice is looking at all those shapes of the mind. But once we say the practice is actually in and of itself, so our job is to just keep trying to bring that practice forth, and whether it's more formless contemplation, whether it's actual formal practice, whether it's going on a pilgrimage, which we can't do now, it's just moving around from our front room to the kitchen to the lounge, but some inner pilgrimage of offering a practice on behalf of others, whatever it is, allowing the practice. And then the second line of that stanza in the Dharma is that the fruit of that practice, the awakening, arises according to the Dharma, not according to your agenda. It arises according to the law, to the karmic law of unfolding, the ripening. That fruit ripens according to something else, not your trying to make it ripe. So that, in a way, is that great patience with these old sankharas and these old, because often really what we're talking about mostly is working that edge of the hindrances.
No matter how many times I am reminded that it's not on my agenda, it is, I just need to hear it all of the time.
That's why they call it remembering the sati. We all do. We lose every second, like, what am I doing here? I'm just upset about something.
And I also hear in that kind patience, like, you didn't say it, so I want to be explicit. It also sounds like kind patience includes like self-compassion, other compassion, like just there's
well, that's a big one. Thanissara and I were talking the other day, there's the deep conditioning of self-loathing, that's so profound for us, this sort of erroneous Judeo-Christian judging God, sinful people, particularly I think that was one of the things that I really felt being in, Asia when I was younger, in India. And I remember this Thai elder coming to visit us as young monastics, and someone said, "What do you do about self-hatred?" And he said, "Pardon?" And they had to ask him about 10 different ways. And in the end, he said, "Well, what would you do that for?" He literally couldn't understand the concept of, guilt and bad self, the sense of the bad self. So this is very systemic and endemic in our Western conditioning, and it's actually global now because, of course, it's been globalized. But I think it's something we also have to attend to and to understand that this is a hindrance to work through, not a description of who we are, but that self-compassion is probably the hardest piece. It's easier to have it for others, and it seems to be very difficult to have it for ourselves.
It's a radical practice.
Yes. Just things like how the compensation for that, I notice in the American culture that there's such a drivenness about work and schedules and the perfectionism of that, and white culture, we sort of the kind of the split that we carry, the abstraction that we're in, a lack of real deep embodiment and connection within the web of life and with earth and with the sense of community. There's this individuated perfectionism that's very heightened, and it's actually tyrannical because it projects inward and we project it out. And so all of these patterns and tendencies and conditionings, we just have to keep getting to know them, their voices, how they operate in the body, where we get seduced by them. And again, that's unpicking the blanket of samsara. That's patient work. Some of it, yeah.
Well, it's beautiful. So take home is lots of compassion, and there's so many take homes. This was so rich. So thank you so much. In the last few minutes, anything else you want to make sure people know, either about this particular practice of showing up with love, or about how to find you, or how to find your book?
Thank you. Well, our website is Sacred Mountain Sangha, which is all one word, .org, and you'll see we put some stuff there. I think the book that Thanissara and I wrote together, called Listening to the Heart, is one where I like that book. It took us a long time to write it. It took 10 years, actually. It was a complex book to write because we were trying to bring in threads around practice with our stories, and we're both from different cultures and backgrounds. Thanissara's from Chattanooga, Tennessee. I'm from London, UK, and our stories through monastic life, through lay life. our connection with Maharaj-ji, our connection with Buddhist practice, the psychospiritual work that I've been talking about, shadow work, the engaged part of Dharma, and to try and make it user-friendly, reasonably light, but with some depth. So that book, I think, is a real guidebook for some of what I've been talking about. It's called Listening to the Heart. And that might be useful for the satsang as a resource.
Wonderful. Thank you.
But everything, I can't thank Ramdas enough. I mean, he was such an extraordinarily courageous guide in a time when people were, he was just so radically, ruthlessly honest about himself and about everything, and would have this great command of language, of course, before his stroke, to just nail everything. And then in the context of this generosity of sharing and opening the door to Maharaj-ji, and then of course post the stroke, it all went so much deeper into this transmission of loving awareness and presence. So I'm grateful to be here with you all and to have this moment of expressing great gratitude to all that carried this lineage forward now, so that we can all participate, all those that were with Maharaj-ji that have carried the devotion and the transmission. It's a great gift. And all of you working to continue that gift. Thank you so much for today.
Thank you. Yes, it is a great gift. And thank you for carrying this gift as well. Thank you for your wisdom and just the richness of this talk and conversation. It's a blessing. And a big thank you to all of the people on the back end who helped make these things happen, JR and Mangala and others. And thank you all for showing up and being here. Just so you know that this will be available for replay at any time on those whatever link you're watching it on. And if you want to continue to see events like this, please consider supporting financially by going to ramdas.org/donate. And I want to mention a couple of opportunities coming up for deepening. The first is Ramdas's new memoir, Being Ramdas, is being released January 12th. It's really exciting. It's an amazing book that describes his life in his own words and has lots of surprising stories in it. It's great if you can pre-order it. There's a few more days to pre-order. If you can do that by going to beingramdas.com. We also have a couple more satsang fellowship events coming up. Next weekend, for those who identify as cisgendered, non-binary, or gender non-conforming women, we have our monthly women's satsang, and we're going to be talking about embodiment from a soul and a female perspective. And on the 31st of January, we have a satsang Zoom call for those who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, also known as the world majority. And you can sign up for either of those by going to ramdas.org/fellowship. And there's an amazing bundle on ramdas.org, the shop. It's the last retreat in Darshan before his passing. And it's a 12-hour offering that dives into subjects such as cultivating self-honesty and awareness, transforming dark thoughts and emotions, and transcending feelings of separation, fear, and polarization. And it has Ramdas and Trudy Goodman and Jack Kornfield and Mirabai Bush. So you can find that there. And lastly, it's not available yet, but in a couple of weeks, there's going to be a new virtual course library that dives into conscious relationships and exploring fear around death and dying, and service and social action. So keep an eye out in your inbox for that. So thank you again, Thanissara, for being here and for the depth and wisdom and devotion and mindfulness that you share. Thank you to all of you. And next month, we'll have Raghu Marcus and special guests talking about love, family, and Bhav. We have a special treat as part of that. So tune in next month. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jackie.